On February 18th, 1478, the stone dungeons of the Tower of London did not reek of blood, but of the sickly sweet scent of wine and death. George was plunged headfirst into a massive butt of Malmsey, choking as the golden liquid flooded his lungs, burning his windpipe instead of air. In the damp darkness, there was only the desperate thud of limbs against wood and the gurgling of rising bubbles, marking the messy, wet final moments of a noble duke. As the brother of King Edward IV, George possessed power second only to the throne, yet he repeatedly allied with enemies in attempts to seize the crown for himself. This relentless treachery ultimately forced the king to issue the grimmest of rulings, his own brother's execution to secure the reign. But what drove a prestigious prince of the Plantagenet line to become the greatest threat to his own family? George was born on October the 21st, 1449 in Dublin Castle. The location matters. He was born away from the English court across the Irish Sea, in a land that was technically a lordship of the English king but operated under its own fierce tribal rules. His father was Richard, Duke of York, the wealthiest nobleman in England, and the man who dared to challenge the weak, pious, and mentally unstable King Henry VI for the control of the kingdom. At the time of George's birth, his father was effectively in exile. Richard had been sent to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant, a prestigious title that thinly veiled a political banishment. The court of Henry VI, controlled by the formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou, wanted the Duke of York as far away from London as possible. They feared his popularity, they feared his wealth, and most of all, they feared his lineage. Richard had a better claim to the throne than the king himself, and everyone knew it. So George entered the world not in the warm embrace of the royal palaces at Westminster or Windsor, but in the stone fortress of Dublin, surrounded by gallo-glass mercenaries and Anglo-Irish lords. He was the sixth son, a spare to the spares. In the brutal calculus of medieval infant mortality, he wasn't expected to be historically significant. His eldest brother, Edward, was the heir. His second brother, Edmund, was the backup. George was just another mouth to feed, another pawn on the board, but he was a Plantagenet. Even as a baby, he was a target. George's childhood was defined by movement, instability, and the looming threat of violence. His mother, Cecily Neville, was known as the Rose of Raby. She was a woman of immense piety, pride, and steely resolve. She had to be. She gave birth to 13 children, and she would bury most of them. In the nursery, George occupied a difficult psychological space. Above him was Edward, the Earl of March. 7 years older than George, Edward was already a man by medieval standards. He was tall, growing to a staggering 6 feet 4 inches, handsome, charismatic, and a natural soldier. Edward was the star, the hope of the House of York. Then there was Edmund, Earl of Rutland, the loyal lieutenant to Edward. Below George was Richard, the future Richard III, born 3 years later in 1452. Richard was sickly, frail, and suffered from a spinal curvature, which naturally drew their mother's protective instincts. And then there was George, healthy but not the heir, royal but not the favorite. He was squeezed between the glorious future king and the vulnerable baby brother. Modern psychology talks about middle child syndrome, the feeling of exclusion and the desperate need to act out to get attention. In George Plantagenet, we see perhaps the most destructive case of this syndrome in history. He learned early on that if he wanted to be noticed in the House of York, he had to be louder, flashier, and more demanding than anyone else. As George grew from a toddler into a boy, the Cold War between his father and the House of Lancaster turned hot. We call this period the Wars of the Roses, a romantic Victorian name for what was essentially a mafia turf war played out on a national scale. It wasn't a polite disagreement over lineage, it was a blood feud. The conflict was fueled by the mental collapse of King Henry VI. The king would slip into catatonic states for months at a time, unable to speak, move, or recognize his own son. Into this power vacuum stepped George's father, claiming the right to rule as protector of the realm. But Queen Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France, fought him every step of the way. She viewed the York family not as political rivals, but as traitors who wanted to kill her son. George was too young to fight, but he wasn't too young to understand fear. He would have heard the hushed conversations between his parents. He would have seen his father wearing armor at the dinner table. He would have sensed the panic when the messengers arrived with bad news. In 1459, when George was 10 years old, the disaster struck at Ludford Bridge. The Yorkist army, facing the king's overwhelming forces, collapsed. The betrayal was total. George's father, along with his older brothers Edward and Edmund, made a split-second decision to flee. They abandoned the castle of Ludlow in the middle of the night, but they left something behind: the women and children. 10-year-old George, 7-year-old Richard, and their mother Cecily were left to face the wrath of the Lancastrian army. When the king's soldiers sacked Ludlow, they found the Duchess of York standing defiantly in the market cross with her 2 terrified young sons. George was taken prisoner. For months he lived in captivity, entrusted to the care of his aunt, the Duchess of Buckingham. This was a pivotal trauma. His father and big brothers had run away to safety in Ireland and Calais, leaving him behind to be captured. Even though they had little choice, to a 10-year-old boy, it must have felt like abandonment. It reinforced a dark lesson. You cannot trust anyone, not even your own blood. When the chips are down, everyone looks out for themselves. The defining moment of George's childhood, the event that shattered his world and likely warped his psyche forever, happened the following year, when he was just 11 years old. The year 1460 began with hope. His father and brothers returned from exile, invaded England, and defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Northampton. They even captured the poor, confused King Henry VI. George was reunited with his father in London. For a brief moment, it seemed the House of York had won. His father, Richard, walked into the House of Lords and laid his hand on the empty throne, claiming it by right. But the Lords hesitated. They weren't ready to depose an anointed king. Instead, they compromised. Henry VI would remain king for life, but Richard of York and his heirs would succeed him. George was now legally a prince in waiting. However, Queen Margaret was still out there, gathering a massive army in the north. She was furious that her son had been disinherited. She summoned the wild men of the Scottish borders, promising them plunder if they marched south. In December 1460, George's father and his favorite brother Edmund rode north to deal with this threat. They stayed at Sandal Castle in Wakefield. George and Richard remained in London with their mother for safety. The news arrived in London in early January 1461. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a massacre. At the Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460, the Duke of York had been lured out of his castle and overwhelmed. The Lancastrians didn't just kill him, they desecrated him. They cut off his head, stuck it on a pike, and fashioned a mocking paper crown to place upon his brow. They displayed his rotting head on the Micklegate bar in the city of York, a grisly warning to anyone who challenged the Queen. But the horror didn't stop there. George's 17-year-old brother Edmund, Earl of Rutland, had tried to flee the battlefield. He was caught on the Wakefield Bridge by Lord Clifford, a Lancastrian noble whose own father had been killed by Yorkists years earlier. The chroniclers tell us that young Edmund fell to his knees begging for mercy. Lord Clifford looked down at the terrified teenager and snarled, "By God's blood, thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee and all thy kin." He drove a dagger into the boy's chest, butchering him in cold blood. Imagine being an 11-year-old boy and hearing that your father is dead, his head is rotting on a gate, and your brother has been murdered while begging for his life. Imagine knowing that the man who killed your brother has vowed to kill all thy kin. That meant George was next. The safety of London evaporated instantly. Queen Margaret's northern host was marching south, burning and looting towns as they came. They were coming for the remaining Yorkist brood. Cecily Neville did not hesitate. She was a woman of action. She knew she could not protect her two youngest sons, George and Richard, if the city fell. She arranged for them to be smuggled out of the country immediately. In the dead of winter, George and his little brother Richard were put on a ship bound for Burgundy. They were stripped of their comfort, their titles, and their parents. They became refugees. The crossing would have been rough, the seas gray and freezing. As George watched the coast of England disappear into the mist, he was leaving behind his childhood. He was no longer just a boy. He was a political asset, a target, and a survivor. They arrived in Utrecht, guests of a strange court, dependent on the charity of strangers. They spent their days waiting for news from England. Every ship that docked could bring news of their eldest brother Edward's death. If Edward died, the House of York was finished, and George would likely spend the rest of his life in exile, or face the assassin's knife. This exile created a profound bond between George and Richard. They were the little brothers, the survivors of the wreckage, but it also planted a deep, festering seed of insecurity in George. He learned that safety is an illusion. He learned that titles mean nothing if you don't have an army to back them up. And most importantly, he learned that power is the only thing that keeps your head on your shoulders. While George sat in safety in Burgundy, his brother Edward, now the Duke of York, was performing miracles. The 18-year-old Edward took command of the shattered Yorkist forces. He was a giant of a man, terrifying in battle and brilliant in strategy. While George waited, Edward fought. This distinction would haunt George for the rest of his life. Edward was the warrior who earned the crown through blood and steel. George was the boy who had been sent away to safety. He would spend his entire adult life trying to prove that he was just as formidable, just as dangerous, and just as royal as the brother who saved them all. While George and Richard shivered in the damp courts of Burgundy, the fate of England was being decided in a blizzard. On Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461, the largest battle ever fought on English soil took place at Towton. It remains a scar on the British landscape. Imagine 50,000 men hacking at each other in a blinding snowstorm. The carnage was so absolute that the local river, the Cockbeck, reportedly ran red with blood for days. George's brother, Edward, the 18-year-old giant, stood at the center of the storm. He fought like a man possessed. When the lines broke and the Lancastrians fled, the snow was littered with 28,000 corpses. The Lancastrian army was annihilated. King Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled to Scotland. The House of York had risen from the ashes. News traveled slowly across the Channel, but when it arrived in Burgundy, it changed George's life instantly. He was no longer the refugee son of a beheaded traitor. He was now the brother of the King of England. In April 1461, George and Richard returned to London. The city that had been too dangerous for them just months prior now threw open its gates. They were greeted with trumpets, pageantry, and the adoration of the crowds. But the dynamic had shifted. When George looked at Edward, he didn't just see a brother. He saw a god king. Edward IV was crowned at Westminster Abbey on June 28, 1461. The ceremony was a masterclass in propaganda. Edward, tall, blonde, and handsome, looked every inch the medieval ideal of a monarch. At the coronation, George was the guest of honor. He was invested as the Duke of Clarence. This wasn't just a title, it was a statement. The title Duke of Clarence had a specific royal resonance. It had belonged to the second son of Edward III. By giving it to George, Edward IV was acknowledging him as the second man in the kingdom. Because Edward was unmarried and childless, George was now the heir presumptive. If Edward took an arrow in the eye or fell off a horse, George would be King George I. George was 12 years old. He was arguably the most valuable, powerful child in Europe. Edward IV knew that the loyalty of his brothers was the bedrock of his new dynasty. He was determined to buy that loyalty with overwhelming generosity. Throughout the early 1460s, honors rained down on George. He was made a Knight of the Garter. He was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a role his father had held, giving him a theoretical power base across the sea. He was granted the forfeited estates of the Earl of Northumberland and the Beauforts. By the time he was a teenager, George controlled a vast swathe of land across the Midlands and the North. His primary seat was the honor of Tutbury. To understand his wealth, we have to look at his household accounts. In an era where a knight might have a few servants, George employed a standing staff of 399 people. His household was a court in miniature. He had his own council, his own treasurer, his own chaplains, musicians, and jesters. He had a literal army of cooks, grooms, and scullions catering to his every whim. When George dined, it was a ceremony. He ate off silver and gold plate. His clothes were made of velvet, satin, and cloth of gold, trimmed with ermine. He was the golden boy's golden brother. He was charming, witty, and possessed the famous Plantagenet eloquence. Foreign ambassadors noted that George was nearly as handsome as the king, though perhaps a little less tall, a little more slight. But inside the golden cage, the rot was setting in. George had grown up in trauma. He had lost his father and brother to violence. He had spent his formative years in fear. Now suddenly, he had everything. But psychologists tell us that sudden wealth rarely cures trauma. It often amplifies the survivor's neuroses. George developed an insatiable hunger for validation. He was the heir presumptive, yes, but that presumptive was a ticking clock. He knew that as soon as Edward married and had a son, George would be demoted. He would just be the king's uncle. He wanted to secure his own power base, independent of his brother. He wanted to be a king in his own right. And then the betrayal happened. For the first few years of the reign, the Yorkist court was a bachelor paradise. Edward IV was busy fighting pockets of Lancastrian resistance and enjoying the company of many mistresses. George was enjoying his wealth. The man running the government was their cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick, known as the kingmaker, was the architect of the Yorkist victory. He was the richest man in England, a seasoned politician, and the mentor to the young king. Warwick was currently in France, negotiating a prestigious marriage for King Edward to a French princess. This alliance would seal the peace and make the House of York untouchable. Then in September 1464, Edward IV dropped a bombshell that shattered the court. He told his council that they could stop looking for a wife for him. He was already married. 5 months earlier, in secret, Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville. The council was stunned. Warwick was humiliated. Elizabeth Woodville was the worst possible candidate for a queen. She was a commoner. Her father was a mere knight. She was a widow. She already had 2 sons from a previous marriage. She was older than the king, and she was Lancastrian. Her first husband had died fighting against the Yorkists. For George, this was a catastrophe. It wasn't just that the king had married beneath him. It was the baggage the new queen brought with her. Elizabeth Woodville had a massive family. She had 5 brothers and 7 unmarried sisters. Almost overnight, the court was flooded with Woodvilles. The new queen demanded titles, land, and wealthy marriages for her siblings. George watched in horror as the Woodville clan began to consume the marriage market. The queen's 20-year-old brother, John Woodville, was married to the Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess was in her late 60s. It was a grotesque, diabolical marriage purely for money, and it scandalized the country. The queen's sisters were married off to the heirs of the Earls of Arundel, Essex, Kent, and Pembroke. These were the heiresses that George's friends and retainers had hoped to marry. The Woodvilles were monopolizing the social ladder. George felt personally slighted. He was a royal duke. He was a Plantagenet. Yet he had to watch these upstarts, these minor gentry, walking around court as if they owned the place. He felt that Edward was insulting the dignity of their bloodline by elevating this low-born family. The tension at family dinners must have been suffocating. Edward IV was enchanted by his wife and fiercely loyal to her family. Any criticism of the Woodvilles was treated as criticism of the king. George, who lacked a filter, likely made his displeasure known. He tried to counter this by securing a powerful marriage for himself. If Edward was going to marry a nobody, George would marry a princess. Diplomats floated the idea of George marrying Mary of Burgundy, the daughter of Charles the Bold. It was a brilliant match. Mary was the heiress to the wealthiest duchy in Europe. If George married her, he would eventually control the Low Countries. He would be a continental potentate equal to his brother. King Edward vetoed it. Edward was smart. He knew his brother. He knew George was erratic, ambitious, and easily led. The last thing Edward wanted was for George to have a massive foreign power base. If George became the Duke of Burgundy, he might decide he wanted to be King of England too. So Edward blocked the marriage. George was furious. He saw this not as political caution, but as spite. My brother doesn't want me to succeed, he thought. He wants to keep me under his thumb. He lets the Woodvilles have everything, but he denies me my birthright. While George stewed in his resentment, someone was watching him. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, was also furious. The kingmaker had been humiliated by the Woodville marriage. He had spent years fighting for the House of York, only to be pushed aside by the Queen's family. Warwick felt that Edward was ungrateful and uncontrollable. Warwick looked at the royal family and saw a fracture. On one side, the king and the Woodvilles. On the other, the discontented elements of the old nobility. And there, sitting in the middle, was George. George was young, impressionable, and desperate for a father figure. Warwick was the ultimate patriarch, powerful, confident, and commanding. Warwick began to groom George. It was a classic seduction, political and personal. Warwick whispered in George's ear what George wanted to hear. "You are right to be angry. The king has lost his way. The Woodvilles are destroying the kingdom. You, George, have the true spirit of your father. And then the poison. Perhaps you would make a better king." It is unclear when the treason began, but by 1467 George and Warwick were inseparable. They spent their time together, hunting and feasting, while the king remained in London with his wife. Warwick had no sons. He had 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne Neville. They were the greatest heiresses in England. Whoever married them would inherit the vast Warwick fortune and the earldom itself. Warwick dangled the ultimate prize before George, his eldest daughter, Isabel. If George married Isabel Neville, he would unite his own royal estates with the massive Neville lands. He would become effectively a co-king. His wealth would dwarf the king's private income. King Edward IV saw this coming a mile away. He explicitly, loudly, and formally forbade the marriage. He told George that under no circumstances was he to marry Isabel Neville. It was a direct order from the crown. In the medieval world, disobeying the king on a matter of marriage was not just teenage rebellion. It was bordering on treason. It challenged the king's authority over his vassals. George didn't care. He was drunk on Warwick's flattery and his own sense of grievance. He convinced himself that he was the victim, that Edward was a tyrant, and that marrying Isabel was his right. The year 1469 was the turning point. The tension in England was snapping. There were riots in the north, likely stirred up by Warwick's agents. The people were grumbling about taxes and the evil influence of the Woodvilles. In July 1469, George made his move. He gathered his household and rode to the coast. He met Warwick and the women, Isabel and Anne, and they boarded a ship for Calais. On July 11, 1469, the ceremony took place in the church of Notre Dame in Calais. The Archbishop of York performed the rites. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, married Isabel Neville. As he said his vows, George wasn't just taking a wife. He was declaring war on his brother. He was sealing a pact of blood with Warwick. They weren't planning a honeymoon. They were planning an invasion. Back in England, King Edward IV was caught off guard. He was up north, suppressing a rebellion with only a small force. He didn't realize that the rebels were actually the vanguard of Warwick's army. He didn't realize that his own brother, the boy he had protected and enriched, was coming to take his crown. George stood on the shores of France, looking back toward the white cliffs of Dover. He was 20 years old. He had chosen his side. From their base in Calais, George and Warwick issued a manifesto. It was a masterpiece of political gaslighting. They claimed they were loyal subjects of the king, merely returning to England to rescue him from the seductive and traitorous influence of the Woodvilles. They listed the realm's grievances, high taxes, lawlessness, and corruption, and pinned them all on Queen Elizabeth's family. But beneath the humble petitioner language, there was a darker subtext. Rumors began to circulate in London taverns, whispers that could only have originated from George's camp. The rumors claimed that Edward IV was illegitimate, that the Rose of Raby, Cecily Neville, had committed adultery with a French archer named Blaborn, and that Edward was the bastard product of that affair. The implication was explosive. If Edward was a bastard, then the true, legitimate heir of the Duke of York was his second son, George. It was a staggering betrayal. George was willing to slander his own mother's honor to steal his brother's crown. George and Warwick landed in Kent and marched toward London. The capital, always fickle, opened its gates. They then moved north to link up with the rebel armies Warwick had raised. King Edward IV, realizing too late the scale of the betrayal, was moving south with his army, but his forces were split. On July 26, 1469, the armies collided at the Battle of Edgecote Moor. George wasn't on the field himself. He and Warwick were hurrying to get there, but their rebel proxies decimated the king's loyalists. It was a slaughter. The aftermath revealed the true nature of George's grievance. This wasn't about better government. It was a hit job. In the days following the battle, George and Warwick captured Earl Rivers, the Queen's father, and John Woodville, her brother. There was no trial. There was no mercy. On Warwick's orders, and with George's tacit approval, they were beheaded in Northampton. George had just signed the death warrant of his own sister-in-law's family. He had spilled the blood of the king's in-laws. There was no going back now. A few days later, King Edward IV himself was captured. He was taken to Warwick Castle, the stronghold of his enemies. For a brief, surreal moment in the summer of 1469, George had won. He was 20 years old, and he had checkmated the great warrior king. With Edward in a cell, George and Warwick attempted to rule England. They issued writs, summoned a parliament, and tried to govern. It was a disaster. The reality of medieval power was that it relied on personal authority. The nobility of England looked at George and Warwick and saw usurpers. They refused to answer the summons. Law and order collapsed completely. Local feuds erupted into private wars because there was no king to stop them. More importantly, the Lancastrians, the old enemy, saw the chaos and started to rise again. George and Warwick realized a terrifying truth. They couldn't rule without Edward. The country simply wouldn't accept George as king while Edward was still alive. And they didn't dare kill Edward. That would make them regicides and pariahs. Defeated by their own victory, they had to let him go. The autumn of 1469 saw the most awkward reconciliation in English history. Edward IV, once released, rode into London. He was rejoined by George and Warwick. Edward played it cool. He knew he wasn't strong enough yet to crush them, so he pretended to forgive them. He blamed the evil counselors for the misunderstanding. He even held a council meeting where he officially pardoned George and Warwick for their treason. Imagine the Christmas court of 1469. The king sat on the throne. To his right stood George, the brother who had kidnapped him and executed his father-in-law. To his left sat the queen, Elizabeth Woodville, having to break bread with the men who murdered her father and brother. The tension must have been unbearable. George, arrogant and foolish, likely believed he had gotten away with it. He thought his brother was weak. He didn't realize that Edward was simply sharpening his knife. George hadn't learned his lesson, neither had Warwick. In March 1470, just months after being pardoned, they instigated another rebellion in Lincolnshire. They used a proxy, Sir Robert Welles, to raise an army against the king. This time, Edward was ready. He moved with lightning speed. He marched his army to Lincolnshire and caught the rebels before they could organize. The ensuing fight was called the Battle of Loosecoat Field because the rebels fled so quickly they threw off their coats to run faster. Before the battle, Edward had captured the rebel leader, Welles. Under interrogation, Welles spilled everything. He confessed that George and Warwick were the masterminds. He named names. Edward now had proof. He publicly declared George and Warwick traitors. He put a price on their heads. The game was up. George and Warwick gathered their families and fled south. This flight led to one of the most harrowing episodes of George's life, an event that likely broke his spirit. They raced to Southampton hoping to steal a ship. They managed to board a vessel, taking with them Warwick's wife and George's wife, Isabel. Isabel was heavily pregnant. She was in the final days of her term, expecting George's first child. They set sail for Calais, the fortress Warwick commanded. They assumed they would find safe harbor there. But as they approached the harbor, the cannons of Calais fired a warning shot across their bow. The lieutenant of the castle, a man Warwick had trusted, had remained loyal to King Edward. He refused to let them dock. The situation turned into a horror story. They were forced to anchor off the coast, bobbing violently in the rough, freezing waters of the English Channel. That night, Isabel went into labor. It was a nightmare scenario. There was no midwife. There was no fresh water. There was only the rolling deck, the smell of salt and fear, and the screams of a young woman in agony. George was helpless. He was a royal duke, used to command, yet he could do nothing to help his wife. The lieutenant in Calais, showing a sliver of mercy, sent out 2 flagons of wine to the ship to help ease Isabel's pain. It is a grim foreshadowing that wine was the only comfort George could offer his dying family. Isabel gave birth on that ship. The child, some sources say a girl named Anne, others an unnamed boy, died almost immediately. George had to watch his firstborn child die in the squalor of a fleeing ship. He had to watch them wrap the tiny body in canvas and commit it to the gray, indifferent sea. This tragedy hardened him. It curdled his ambition into a bitter, nihilistic rage. Desperate, humiliated, and grieving, the refugees sailed on to France. They landed in Honfleur, casting themselves at the feet of King Louis I. Louis I, known as the Universal Spider, was the master of intrigue. He saw an opportunity. He realized that the only way to topple Edward IV was to unite the two enemies of the House of York. Louis proposed the unthinkable, an alliance between Warwick George and Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was the Lancastrian queen. She was the woman who had led the army that killed George's father. She was the woman who had put the paper crown on his father's severed head. She was the monster of George's childhood nightmares. Louis XI brought them together in a room. He forced Warwick and George to kneel before Queen Margaret. Warwick had to beg for forgiveness for ruining her life. And George? George had to stand there and pledge his sword to the woman who butchered his family. But the betrayal got worse. The new alliance, the Treaty of Angers, had a specific condition. They would invade England and restore King Henry VI to the throne. But who would be the heir? Margaret of Anjou was clear. The heir would be her son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. To seal the deal, Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, was betrothed to Prince Edward. George was stunned. The whole point of his rebellion, the whole reason he had committed treason, was to make himself king. Now Warwick was telling him that he was just a placeholder. The terms were Henry VI would be king, his son Edward would be heir. George would be next in line if the Lancastrian line failed. George wasn't stupid. He knew the Lancastrian line wouldn't fail. Warwick had played him. Warwick didn't care about George. He only cared about his own blood sitting on the throne. By marrying Anne to the prince, Warwick would be the grandfather of future kings. George was now useless to him. In September 1470, the invasion fleet launched. George Plantagenet was returning to England, but not as a liberator. He was returning as the junior partner in a coalition of people who hated him. The invasion was shockingly successful, but not because of George's military brilliance. It succeeded because the north of England rose up for Warwick, and the betrayal within King Edward's ranks was absolute. Edward IV, realizing his army was dissolving around him and that he was about to be captured by his brother, made a desperate escape. George had done it. He had helped drive his brother out of the kingdom. But as they rode into London to liberate King Henry VI from the Tower of London, the reality of what they had done hit George like a physical blow. Henry VI was found in a squalid room, dirty, confused, and barely clinging to sanity. This was the man George had just committed treason to restore. The readeption, the second reign of Henry VI, was a period of pure misery for George. Parliament was summoned. They declared Edward IV a traitor and a usurper. George had to sit there and listen as his own brother was legally stripped of his humanity. But then came the sting. The Parliament also settled the succession. The crown would go to Henry VI, then to his son, Prince Edward. George was named merely the Duke of Clarence. He had traded being the brother of a king for being the servant of a madman and a French queen. He was isolated. The Lancastrian lords, men like the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Oxford, looked at George with undisguised loathing. To them, he was still a Yorkist dog, a traitor who had helped kill their fathers at Towton. They tolerated him only because Warwick insisted. While George sulked in London, the women of the House of York went to work. From Burgundy, George's sister Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, began a secret correspondence. She was a formidable woman who loved her brothers, but she knew that a divided House of York was a dead House of York. She sent secret messengers to George. The message was simple and brutal. Do you really think Margaret of Anjou will let you live? You are a Plantagenet. You are the son of the man she beheaded. As soon as she is secure, she will cut your throat. Your only hope is your brother. George's wife, Isabel, also played a crucial role. She was Warwick's daughter, but she was watching her inheritance being signed away to her sister Anne. Isabel whispered in George's ear at night, fueling his paranoia and his regret. George began to waver. He sent secret letters back to his exiled brother Edward in Burgundy. He made a promise. If you return, I will make it right. In March 1471, the impossible happened. Edward IV landed at Ravenspur on the Yorkshire coast. He had a tiny force, barely 1,200 men. It was a suicide mission. Edward marched south, bluffing his way past hostile cities. As he moved south, his army grew. The Earl of Warwick, panic-stricken, sent orders to George. George was in the West Country, raising an army of 4,000 men. Warwick ordered him to intercept Edward and crush him. This was the moment of truth. The fate of England rested on George Plantagenet's decision. On April 3rd, 1471, on the road to Banbury, the two armies came into view. On one side, King Edward IV with his hardened veterans. On the other, George, Duke of Clarence, with the fresh levies of the West. Warwick expected a battle. He expected George to attack. Instead, the soldiers watched in stunned silence as George rode out alone from his lines. Edward rode out to meet him. In the middle of the field, between thousands of armed men holding their breath, the two brothers dismounted. They didn't draw swords. They embraced. It was a piece of political theater, choreographed to perfection, but the emotion was real. George fell to his knees, begging forgiveness. Edward raised him up, kissing him on the cheek and calling him brother. George ordered his men to toss aside their Lancastrian badges. They shouted, "King Edward!" The two armies merged into one massive Yorkist host. George had turned his coat for the last time. He was back where he belonged, but he had betrayed Warwick, his father-in-law, his mentor, the man who had made him. The reckoning came on Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1471, at the Battle of Barnet. It was fought in a thick supernatural fog. Visibility was less than 10 yards. It was a chaotic, confusing brawl. George fought alongside his brothers, Edward and Richard. For the first time in years, the three sons of York were united in battle. In the confusion of the mist, the Lancastrian lines collapsed due to friendly fire. The Earl of Warwick was killed trying to flee. When George saw the body of Warwick, the man who had been a second father to him, stripped naked and laid out on the floor of St. Paul's Cathedral later that week, he must have felt a complex mix of relief and guilt. The man who had fueled his ambition was dead. Now George was beholden only to his brother. But the war wasn't over. Queen Margaret and her son, the Lancastrian Prince Edward, had finally landed in England on the very day Warwick died. Edward, George, and Richard marched west to intercept them. They caught them at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471. This battle broke the back of the House of Lancaster. The Yorkists, flushed with victory and commanded by the brilliant Edward, smashed the Lancastrian line. What happened next is one of the darkest stains on the reputation of the House of York. The Lancastrian Prince of Wales, Edward of Westminster, the 17-year-old boy George had sworn allegiance to just months before, was found on the battlefield. Later, Tudor propaganda claims that the prince was brought before the three York brothers, and that they stabbed him to death. The reality was likely more gritty, but the result was the same. The prince was dead. The Lancastrian line was extinguished. There was one loose end left, the old king, Henry VI. Edward IV returned to London in triumph on May 21st. That very night, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official statement said he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. Nobody believed it. It was a state-sanctioned murder to ensure that the Lancastrian cause was dead forever. Most historians point the finger at Richard, Duke of Gloucester, but George was there. The blood was on all their hands. By the summer of 1471, the House of York was supreme. The wars were over. Edward was king, undisputed. George was restored to all his lands and titles. He was the Duke of Clarence, the great Chamberlain, the Earl of Warwick by right of his wife, and the Lord of Richmond. It should have been happily ever after. But trust is like a mirror. Once broken, you can glue it back together, but you can still see the cracks in the reflection. Edward IV smiled at George, gave him gifts, and drank with him, but he never forgot. He knew that George was capable of treason. He knew that George had named him a bastard. He knew that George had hunted him. And George hadn't changed. The adrenaline of the war faded, and the old boredom and paranoia returned. The conflict now centered on the corpse of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. The kingmaker was dead, but he had left behind the largest private fortune in England. Legally, this property should have gone to Warwick's widow, the Countess Anne, but she was ignored. The real claimants were her two daughters, Isabel Neville, married to George, and Anne Neville, the 15-year-old widow of the Lancastrian prince. George's logic was simple. I am the husband of the eldest daughter. The younger daughter is a traitor's widow whose husband was killed in battle. Therefore, I should get everything. George expected to inherit the entire Warwick estate. He effectively kidnapped the Countess of Warwick, his mother-in-law, and kept her under guard. But he forgot one variable: his little brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard, now 19 years old, was the Constable of England and the king's most loyal general. Richard had his eyes on the northern estates of the Warwick inheritance, and to get them, he decided to marry the younger sister, Anne Neville. This news sent George into a blind rage. He realized that if Richard married Anne, the inheritance would have to be split in half. George would lose 50% of his fortune. What followed is one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history. To prevent the marriage, George kidnapped his sister-in-law, Anne Neville. According to the Croyland Chronicle, George disguised one of the greatest heiresses in England as a kitchen maid. He hid her in a cramped, greasy cookshop in London. For weeks, the daughter of the kingmaker was scrubbing pots and peeling onions, hiding from the Duke of Gloucester. George hoped that if he could keep her hidden long enough, he could force her into a convent, rendering her legally dead and securing the whole fortune for himself. But Richard utilized his network of spies and eventually tracked her down. He liberated Anne from the scullery and immediately moved her to the sanctuary of Saint-Martin-le-Grand. The dispute between George and Richard became so venomous that it threatened to restart the Civil War. They argued in the royal council chamber with such fury that even the experienced lawyers were terrified. King Edward IV had to step in. Edward forced a compromise in 1474. It was an act of parliament that legally disinherited the boy's mother-in-law, so the sons could split the loot. George kept the earldoms of Warwick and Salisbury and the massive Midlands estates. Richard got the northern estates. George had won a massive fortune, but he didn't see it that way. He saw it as a loss. He had been forced to share. He felt cheated by the king and usurped by his younger brother. The resentment that had fueled his treason in 1469 was bubbling up again. Despite his greed, George did have a personal life. He and Isabel seemed to have had a genuinely close relationship. They finally produced heirs for the House of Plantagenet, Margaret and Edward. George was a father. He had a dynasty. But the curse of the Plantagenets was coming for him. In December 1476, just 2 months after giving birth to a short-lived son, Isabel Neville fell ill. She began to waste away. She was coughing blood, consumed by fever, and delirious. It was likely pulmonary tuberculosis or puerperal fever. On December 22, 1476, Isabel passed away at the age of 25. George was shattered. Isabel had been his anchor. Without her, he became unmoored. George refused to accept that Isabel had died of natural causes. In his mind, the world was a conspiracy against him. He fixated on a servant named Anchoret Twinihoe. Anchoret was an elderly gentlewoman, a servant of the family who had likely known Isabel since she was a child. There was absolutely no evidence that she had harmed anyone, but George needed a scapegoat. In his grief-stricken mania, he convinced himself that Anchoret had poisoned Isabel's ale. In April 1477, 4 months after Isabel's death, George snapped. He decided he was above the law. He assembled a private army of 80 armed soldiers. He marched to Anchoret's home in Somerset, kicked down her door, dragged the terrified elderly woman from her bed, and threw her onto a horse. They rode hard back to Warwick, a journey of nearly 70 miles. The next day, George convened a court, but this wasn't a trial. It was a lynching with paperwork. George packed the courtroom with his own men. He stood over the jury, a royal duke in a rage, and effectively told them, "Find her guilty, or you're next." The jurors were terrified. They returned a guilty verdict within hours. George ordered Anchoret Twinihoe to be taken to the gallows immediately. She was hanged until dead. This was George's fatal mistake. In 15th century England, the king's peace was sacred. A duke could not simply march across the country, kidnap a subject of the king, and execute them on a whim. That was the behavior of a warlord, not a peer. When news of the execution reached London, King Edward IV was cold with fury. He saw this for what it was, a direct challenge to his authority. After the judicial murder of Anchoret Twinihoe, George returned to London, but he was a changed man. He was gaunt, erratic, and consumed by a dangerous cocktail of grief and paranoia. He stopped eating at the royal table, publicly implying that the king or queen might try to poison him. Adding fuel to the fire, it was during this time that a dark prophecy began to circulate in the court, a whisper that would eventually become legend. A soothsayer had supposedly told the king that his successor would be a man whose name began with G. George seized on this. He believed the prophecy referred to him. In his delusional state, he began to see himself as the preordained king. But the king also heard the prophecy, and his gaze turned toward George, not with fear of George's destiny, but with fury at George's ambition. King Edward decided to fire a warning shot. In May 1477, the king's agents arrested Thomas Burdett, a member of George's household, and Dr. John Stacey, a chaplain and astronomer. They were accused of using black magic to imagine the death of the king. Burdett and Stacey were tried, found guilty, and hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a direct message to George: stop conspiring or you are next. George ignored the warning. In fact, he doubled down. He stormed into the royal council chamber at Westminster while the king was away. He brought with him a Franciscan friar who had heard Burdett's final confession. George forced the friar to read Burdett's declaration of innocence to the stunned lords. George stood there, declaring that the king's justice was flawed, that the king had murdered an innocent man, and by extension that the king was a tyrant. This was the breaking point. By publicly defending a convicted traitor, George was effectively accusing the king of judicial murder. Edward IV returned to London in a cold rage. He had forgiven George for everything else, but he would not forgive this. Edward summoned George to the Palace of Westminster. When George arrived expecting another shouting match, he found armed guards. The king accused him of conduct derogatory to the laws of the realm. For the first time in his life, George was not treated as a royal duke. He was stripped of his sword and marched to the Tower of London. The gates slammed shut. George would never walk out of the Tower a free man again. In January 1478, Parliament gathered for a spectacle that hadn't been seen in generations: a king putting his own brother on trial for his life. The trial took place in the Painted Chamber of the Palace of Westminster. The atmosphere was suffocating, but the most shocking part of the trial was the prosecutor. Edward IV didn't hire a lawyer to present the case. He did it himself. The king stood before the House of Lords, tall, imposing, and majestic. He laid out the charges against his brother with forensic precision. He spoke of the unnatural, loathly treason of the Duke of Clarence. The charges were a greatest hits of George's bad behavior: slander, judicial murder, treasonous alliances, and conspiracy. George was allowed to answer the charges. He stood alone in the dock. Witness accounts describe the debate between the two brothers as fierce. George vehemently denied the treason. He claimed he was a loyal subject who was being framed by his enemies. He demanded trial by combat. He offered to fight any man who accused him, including the king's champion. But the tragedy of the trial was the silence of everyone else. Usually in a trial of a peer, someone speaks up, but George had alienated everyone. The Woodvilles hated him. The Lancastrians hated him. The old nobility feared him. Even his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stayed silent. George was completely isolated. He was a man shouting into a void. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The Duke of Buckingham was appointed Lord High Steward to pronounce the sentence. With tears reportedly streaming down his face, Buckingham declared George Plantagenet guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. George was stripped of all his titles. He was led back to the Tower of London to await the end. For days, Edward IV hesitated. He sat in his palace, staring at the death warrant. He delayed. He hoped perhaps that life imprisonment would be enough. But the House of Commons, likely prodded by the Woodvilles, grew impatient. They argued that as long as George lived, the king's throne was in danger. Edward finally broke. He signed the warrant, but he granted George one final mercy. The execution would be private within the walls of the tower. And, according to tradition, George was allowed to choose the manner of his death. On the morning of February 18th, 1478, the Tower of London was quiet. There was no public scaffold erected on Tower Hill. George was 28 years old. We do not know the exact details of his final moments. No chronicler was present in the room. But the official announcement that followed was brief and terrified. The Duke of Clarence was dead. Almost immediately, the rumor hit the streets of London, a whisper that seemed too grotesque to be true. The Duke had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt was a massive cask holding roughly 105 to 126 gallons. Malmsey was a strong, sweet wine imported from Greece. It was expensive, potent, and by all accounts, George's favorite drink. Why the wine? Some suggest that King Edward IV, in a moment of cruel irony, ordered his brother to be drowned in the thing he loved most. Others believe it was a clean death that left the body intact for burial. Or perhaps George, in a moment of nihilistic humor, asked for it himself. For a long time, the wine story was dismissed as folklore. But forensic science suggests otherwise. George was buried in Tewkesbury Abbey, next to his beloved wife Isabel. When the vault was opened and the bones examined, The skeleton believed to be George's showed no signs of beheading. There were no signs of strangulation or hanging. The body was intact. This lends strong credibility to the theory that he was indeed suffocated or drowned. George died, but the tragedy of his line was just beginning. The curse of the Plantagenets passed to his children. George left behind 2 infants, Edward, the new Earl of Warwick, age 3, and Margaret, age 4. Their lives were destroyed by their father's treason. Because George had been attainted, his children were legally barred from inheriting the throne. George's son, Edward, had perhaps the saddest life of any royal in English history. When the Tudors took the throne in 1485, Henry VII locked the boy in the Tower of London. Edward grew up in solitary confinement, cut off from the world. In 1499, after 14 years of imprisonment, Henry VII had him executed on trumped-up charges to clear the way for a Spanish alliance. He was the last legitimate male Plantagenet. George's daughter, Margaret, survived to become the Countess of Salisbury. She was one of the wealthiest women in England, but the wrath of the king eventually found her too. In 1541, an elderly Margaret fell afoul of Henry VIII. She was sentenced to death. Her execution was a horror show, hacked to death by an inexperienced executioner. Some legends say that Margaret wore a bracelet with a charm of a wine barrel on it, a silent, lifelong memorial to the father she barely knew. History and William Shakespeare has not been kind to George Plantagenet. In Richard III, Shakespeare paints false, fleeting, perjured Clarence as a weak, dream-plagued traitor, but the real George was more complex than a stage villain. He was a casualty of a family that had forgotten how to love each other. He was a boy traumatized by the violent death of his father, a teenager corrupted by unimaginable wealth, and a man consumed by the agonizing reality of being second best. He spent his entire life trying to claw his way out of his brother's shadow. He wanted to be the sun, but he was only ever a moon, reflecting the light of greater men. George Plantagenet had the charm of his father, the ambition of his brother Edward, and the ruthlessness of his brother Richard. But he lacked Edward's luck and Richard's discipline. In the end, his death was the perfect metaphor for his life, extravagant, bizarre, self-destructive, and ultimately a little bit ridiculous. He drowned in the excess he so craved.